Can you talk a bit about how your ideas of place and space are reflected in your work?
Well, also, when I'm thinking about place, I talked earlier about travelling through a space, and part of the make of the work is how I collect my materials as I walk the world, if you like. Most of the materials I use, apart from some paints and dyes, I collect while I travel. Nothing is purchased anew. It's all repurposed. It's not imperfect, it's imperfect. I love the imperfections, the things that are torn or weathered. So if I'm looking immediately behind me, I can look at this piece on the left of me, the yellow piece, which is based on my great-grandparents who are featured in the top. Some of the textiles were gathered while I was in India a few years ago, and Romani gypsies came from northwest India millennia ago, and through my great-grandparents I'm trying to remind people that there is that long noble history behind the travelling people who call themselves Romanis as opposed to Gypsy, a very specific area of the Gypsy community. And I've used a symbol of the kettle because the first thing I do when somebody comes around, and I think I've always felt that, so symbiology comes into it, the idea that you welcome someone with a cup of tea. If somebody's had a long journey, you want to give them refreshment. That's hospitality, the sort of hospitality we need to be giving to more people that we meet while we travel. But fundamentally, the materials themselves are part of the make of the piece. So an edge of a cloth might suggest an edge of a landscape. A button might physically reflect the way something's tied down. For me, I paint with the cloth. The cloth becomes my medium as much as the colour that I add to it. So a fold and the way that they don't hang straight, that they aren't rigid, they're not stretched, suggests a life that might have once held those pieces. And again, there is another quote if you would like to hear from it, and it was an interview I had for an American magazine who were very interested in the way that I work. It's by Reese Freeman Zachary. And I believe that she sums it up quite well. She says that the fascination I have with materials are explored in the intersections of a place where we may also inhabit the built environment, those intersections between nature and the industrial or the urban, that our presence on this planet are always here. But of my specific processes and how I formulate them, she says everything she uses, the materials, the substrate, the techniques, are in service to her vision. Her ideas are neither material driven nor idea driven. Cass also says of her work, she keeps a sketchbook, but she doesn't sit down with an idea firmly in mind but try to make it concrete. Rather, she follows an internal thread and it weaves its way from piece to piece, so the whole body of work is subliminally connected to the idea.
Can you tell us a bit about the role of the found object in your work? It seems to be quite a significant factor.
My first book was called The Found Object in Textile Art. I collect. I don't know an artist that doesn't collect, but for me collection is I'm almost driven to collect things, seeing the possibilities in what something can become. I'm very specific though. I think the found objects I enjoy using are the tactile things, the things that pass slightly through your hands. And it's the power they have to unleash something. So you can ask questions of it. It's not a blank canvas. You have to have a dialogue with anything that you find. And you need to be sensitive towards what it can suggest to you. So a handkerchief, and I've used those quite frequently in my work, for me are also a symbol of a common human connection that's disappearing from our everyday life because most people don't use handkerchiefs. I also think that whilst I'm very interested in the environment, repurposing and reusing things is in my blood, it's in my bones. I wasn't necessarily conscious of it, but I do remember saving things as a child, of an age that I still remember. I don't remember the war, but my parents did. And so you did reuse things. But I think we need to start really investigating that again, this throwaway society. So there is a broader spectrum to my work. That for me, the found object has a personal motivation, but there is also a need to reuse on both a cultural and I suppose a financial, and I don't mean financial in terms of money, but it could well be that. I'm talking about the cost to the earth.
Can you talk about your engagement with family histories and the implications for your own practice currently?
I've already covered some aspect of my family history, but I think one of the most relevant parts of my history is the fact that we were storytellers. And I'm not talking about making up stories, I'm talking about stories of the everyday. I remember walking with Dad home from work, and he would get me to look up at the buildings and think about what they were for and what their purpose, function was, what age they were, and I was encouraged to look around me and ask questions. He in fact had written his own history down shortly before he died, and strangely enough the family had written notes that my grandmother passed on verbally about her upbringing. So I think perhaps Simon and I'm at the next stage. I'm just passing on the stories that are relevant to me now for the future generation, that those small things that we perceive every day are important, and that who we are is based on where we've come from as much as where we're going.
I'm interested to hear, Cass, how you feel about how textile work sits within the current array of contemporary art practice.
It's always a question that shifts my thinking. At different times I'm asked that question, but one thing I'm kind of grounded in is it's always been within a debate about art versus craft, male versus female, domestic versus the world outside. I believe, for me, it's fundamental to my practice, and it's a valued aspect of the creative process for artists. It has a lot that it can communicate, and any aspect of historical marginalisation of the textiles has come down to where it sits, that it's normally the thing to do with craft, with the making, with the domestic within home, and that can be seen as being other than the great world of art outdoors within the main male-dominated art world that I think we still sit within today. I'm happy in this liminal space, though. I feel very confident that what I do is question those divisions with my own work, because people can't place it. They want to say it's craft because it's with a needle and thread, but it's not made in the same way as some of the other pieces that we might be more familiar with, that we see in our museums. Yet at the same time it echoes that tradition. At other times, and it wasn't me who coined the phrase painting with cloth, a painter had seen my work and said, well, you're doing exactly what anybody else does, but you're painting with cloth. So that liminal space of neither being wholly art-based or craft-based, but somewhere in between, I think it's about breaking those barriers down, that any artist should be able to work with whatever medium they choose to work to express their ideas. And for me, that's what's fundamental, that art is about communicating an idea, irrespective of what materials it sits within. And all other debates are constructs to exclude people from the discourse about whether it's an art form or not. And I will continue to fight those arguments that have been ongoing since women first got the vote about what we're able to do as artists, as both women and from the domestic sphere and ongoing. And I'm going to give another quote because Rosika Parker and her partner Griselda Pollock had written a book called The Subversive Stitch. And she reminds us that the role textile art plays in our cultural history is. She says, for women today, the contradictory and complex history of embroidery is important because it reveals that definitions of sexual difference and the definitions of art and artists so weights against women are not fixed. They have shifted over the centuries and they can be transformed in the future. I want to be part of that transformation.
And Cass, which other artists do you find interesting or inspirational in relation to your practice?
I have a whole cupboard full of them, and it's really hard to single out, and they change. If I hark back to where I grew up in Norwich, the Norwich School of Painters, their impressionistic watercolours were of the time shocking to some people. Chrome and Cotman watercolours are named after John Searle Cotman. I grew up looking at those watercolours and realising that they were of value. And they're probably a little known group of artists on the national database of great artworks, but I would say have a look, just see how groundbreaking they were at the time. And that was obviously my first engagement, is through the artists I knew. Japanese artist called Ichigo Kubota, he died 15 years ago, but his work continues and his family continues to make the pieces. He creates a vision of a Japanese landscape through the kimono as seasons changing. And he rediscovered a Japanese art form and historically re-represented it in his own work, a dye form. They're amazing works, beautiful. And I studied in Japan, so there's a whole, I would say, history of Japanese textiles for their fine work that I admire. Louise Bourgeois, she talks about the reparative nature of stitch. Her father was a tailor, and the fact that she used the voice of textiles to state her place in the world and what she was connected to and what she was concerned about. Eva Hess, her wonderful three-dimensional sculptures that, to all intents and purposes, are textile based. They are formed by the way that they're bound together with thread, or their structural possibilities have that suggestion of open form that rather than solid sculpture. There are many others as well, but I think that's enough to get on with.